It is probably no coincidence that the decision that appears to have very much been a joint and collective one around the Irish mainstream media to create this bogeyman group of the far right in Ireland coincides with new restrictions being imposed by Facebook, which will take effect from the 1st of October 2020. These are arguably the most draconian restrictions imposed by any social media, any mainstream or large social media operator that has ever arisen. And there's a larger legal question that arises with an operator like Facebook or Google or YouTube. It actually really arises with YouTube. And the question is whether or not that website or social media operator is a platform or a publisher. It now seems that from the 1st of October 2020, at least perhaps how it operates in Ireland or maybe in the European Union, Facebook has decided that it is going to be a publisher. This may not turn out too easily for them, because if a person or a group is a publisher, then they shall be liable for any defamation proceedings issued against them, or for any defamation claim that might arise from something that is put up on their publication. Reading through the terms and conditions of Facebook, they're particularly vindictive and they're particularly draconian. So people who may have had a Facebook strike in the past can have that used against them retrospectively. Even though they did their time in what we call Facebook jail, it's going to be used against them again. This, combined with the absolutely batty, hysterical response of the Irish Times and RTE to what they are calling the far right, is not a sign that we are losing out here on the genuine alternative scene. It is a sign that we are winning. Those of us who remember Christmas of 1989 will recall the final speech given by Nicolae Ceausescu on the balcony in Bucharest, and how when Ceausescu, who was a psychopath who did so much damage to Romania under the communist dictatorship, when Ceausescu emerged on the balcony, he emerged full of cockiness, which possibly he was justified in feeling, having been allowed to do whatever he wanted from 1965 up to 1989. Within 3 or 4 days he was dead, along with his wife. And this goes to show that these people respond, these monsters like Ceausescu, respond with heightened arrogance and heightened hubris when they are actually in their final days. A very important shift has taken place here in Ireland. It doesn't appear to have taken place so much so in the UK or the US, but it most certainly has taken place here in Ireland. Fear has entered the mainstream media. This is actually a consequence, possibly an unintended side effect, of the fact that our mainstream media here in Ireland, which is all Dublin-centred, is so incestuous and is in fact one little cesspit that they all swim around. So where you have a more fragmented mainstream media, as you have in the UK and as you have in the US, when panic sets in, it's not necessarily going to they're not all going to fall like dominoes instantly. But that is precisely what has happened to the mainstream media here in Ireland. The fact that they are now making such ridiculous remarks about the anti-mask movement, about the general conservative movement around such people as John Waters, and that they're so unfounded and batty, and the fact that it has electrified the whole mainstream media group, is unprecedented. It's never been like this in Ireland before. It's a terribly encouraging sign. It's a sign that for the first time, we on the alternative scene have, very crudely, in a very crude and clumsy way, but we have forced them in the mainstream media to engage with us on our terms. That's why it is so important and so profoundly significant. But in the final days of Ceausescu, he was at his most vicious. And he set his army out to murder many hundreds of Romanian civilians who were protesting. It got particularly poisonous and atrocious in a town in Romania called Timișoara. This is the phase that we are in now in Ireland. Facebook looks like it's going to be closed down on commentators like myself and certain other people who I won't mention in this video, and that's going to happen on the 1st of October. This next thing is a very important message. That's a good sign, not a bad sign. That's a sign we're winning, not a sign that we're losing. But what will we do in the immediate when our voice is stifled on the 1st of October? Well, Donald Trump, who I'm a big supporter of and a big admirer of, published a book called Think Big, and Trump is right. What we have to do is start again. There are people out there in Ireland who support us, who are in our scene in Ireland, who know how to write code. What we have to do is build a new Facebook, build a new YouTube, build a new Twitter. And we need to indemnify in that from the outset that it is only a platform. It is not a publisher. So anybody who puts material on that's defamatory, and people do that. And many people on the who call themselves to be alternative, many people who are in that very, very small actual group that could more realistically be called far right, make scandalous remarks. And they make them in a scattergun and indiscriminate way against people who they disagree with. They need to be made accountable for that. And the way they're made accountable for that is by being sued for defamation in the civil courts. So there are procedures there to protect people's good names. But in any new platform that we build ourselves, which we'll have to start from scratch with, we need from the outset to state that we are a platform and not a publisher. That's the way that we will indemnify ourselves either from being shut down by the authorities or from being sued in our own name. The other issue when you create independent platforms on the internet is that you get nonsense coming around. So besides defamation and besides anything else being a platform or a publisher, any operation in the Republic of Ireland has to obey the criminal code as well. And there are very clear and long established laws in Ireland to prevent the dissemination of child pornography. And also to prevent that platform from being used to groom children to meet for underage sex. Those are two persistent blights of the internet in general, and not least of which being the alternative scene. So when we create our new platform, we also need to be vigilant about making sure that nonces don't use it to groom kids. The police, the Gardaí, look in on all these things all the time anyway, so there isn't that much to worry about. But that is a persistent peril and pestilence of the alternative scene. So our new platform must be really for the articulation of political opinions, but it's not for us to edit who can put in, or to edit what can be put in, or to decide that certain people can or cannot be excluded. Irrespective of how liberal one decides to make the platform and how open one decides to make the platform, if people are using the platform to, as I said, groom children or to overtly incite or arrange terrorist acts, then they need to be excluded. So the notion that there can be any platform that includes absolutely everybody saying anything that they want to, that was the early days of the 1990s internet. That's not the way it's going to be now. But the indemnity around being sued for defamation, for general remarks that might be made about somebody, is that it's said very clearly at the start that it's merely a platform and not a publisher. People are now, in the alternative scene, many people are in a state of confusion. But you must understand that we're dealing with psychopaths in Ireland. Leo Varadkar is an appalling psychopath. Fadaka, as Thomas Sheridan calls him. He's an appalling psychopath. A core trick of psychopaths is to baffle and to confuse. So Why should we be surprised that we're baffled and confused? I'm not baffled and confused, I just know they're psychopaths. As a digression, people who run pubs and restaurants in Ireland are lamenting the fact that once again they're having to close down. Well, folks, more fool you. Because anybody, when the first lockdown started in March or April of this year, anybody who looked at that would have seen that the economy was knackered. And that continuing to operate in the private sector hospitality industry in the context of what happened in March and April this year was never going to be a runner. Furthermore, the arbitrary nature with which the lockdown was imposed in March and April of this year was such that anybody who knows how the government works should know not to trust them, and should know that they lie, and should know that they are incompetent, and should know that they are dishonest. So this false dawn that happened in July and August of this year, where some reopenings were allowed, that was a trick. As much as making people wear masks is a trick. That's a trick as well. That's a shit test. Because if you look at the legislation pertaining to wearing masks, in fact, it's so weak and it's so unenforceable that masks aren't mandatory, in effect. And what was happening with the hospitality industry and the pubs and those pubs who are serving food, and the messing around with the €9, you have to buy a €9 meal to have alcohol and all the rest of it. Anybody who knows the situation would have said, I won't reopen. I'll sell. But pubs reopened, and pubs got in food and hired in staff, and then they found last week that they were suckers. I sympathise primarily with their floor staff, most of whom were on minimum wages. I do not sympathise so much with the owners and managements of those pubs and restaurants, because they should have seen what was coming. And part of their problem is that they're complacent, and part of the problem is that until very, very recently, their lobby group, the Licensed Vintners Federation, was absolutely tightly in bed with the government and the establishment. So when they were thrown onto the bus in March of this year, they didn't know what hit them. Never give a sucker an even break. And that's what happened with our pub industry and our restaurant industry, and to a certain extent our hotel industry this year. I will personally be very surprised if there's any hospitality industry of any significance left in this country by March of next year. Because now we're going into winter. The tourists that we might have had are gone. We haven't had any tourists this year, really. But the summer season for the Irish hotels and restaurants and pubs has now come to an end. In early September, I was in central Dublin and I had to go to a meeting, and I decided to go for a cup of coffee in the Shelbourne Hotel afterwards. I was in the Shelbourne Hotel for over an hour. All of the various different eateries and hostelry rooms in the Shelbourne have closed because there's nobody going. So they're serving all of their food and drink and teas and coffees in one room, number 27, which faces out onto Stevens's Green. It was a Tuesday. It was a weekday during business season in early September. There was nobody in the hotel. I mean that. I was the only customer in the Shelbourne Hotel for over an hour on what should be a busy Tuesday in early September. The city centre itself was like a ghost town. The parking reminded me of the 1970s. Any Dubliner will know in the 70s you could just drive in and really park anywhere. Well, that's what it was like, except you still to pay because the clampers will be on your back as the private industry bastards that they are. In the 70s you could park for free. Well, there were places where you had to put money in a meter. But it was much more relaxed in those days. But anyway, I could park anywhere. I parked in Stevens Green. There are parking spaces in Stevens Green. Park there. Paid for it. You pay with an app on your iPhone. And there was only a handful of people walking around Stevens Green. So I've digressed away from the notion of creating a new media for ourselves, which we will do. We will do that. All it takes is one computer expert, one geek. I'm a geek in other things, but not computer code. Maybe I should learn. We will build a new platform here. We will do it. We will create a new YouTube. We will create a new Twitter. We will create a new Facebook. So, although it looks like we're being put out of action on the 1st of October. This is just Facebook succumbing to the whole hysterics that are infesting the mainstream media at the moment. And it's not a sign that we're losing, it's a sign that we're winning.